This year on the summer solstice, Yeshua used my body as a vessel for him to channel his energy through with the intention of releasing the trauma of the crucifixion. And by doing so, releasing the collective consciousness of karmic patterns. My name is Janet, and I'm an energy therapist and an earth grid worker. And I'd like to share with you my experiences of working on the planet, including this most recent chapter, because of the far reaching implications that it has on our collective evolution and ascension process. Um, I want to give you a bit of context that led up to this event to put you in the picture as to the work that I was doing, and then share with you my experience of Yeshua releasing the crucifixion through me as a cell or a conduit. Again, what I think it means and how you might see this coming up in your life. So, um, just to tell you that I have been working on Earth and its grid for 2.5 years now. So I feel that was a very steep learning curve for me. And I went to a lot of very well-known ancient and sacred sites, including places like, the pyramids in Giza. I went to Babaji's cave. I went to Lake Titicaca, Machu Picchu. I went to Mount Shasta. I went to quite a lot of places that, in some schools of thought, are considered to be Earth's primary chakras. And that's how I was first guided. And I feel that there was a huge coherence between the work on the planet and my individual work on my own chakras. Um, I was also doing a lot of balancing of divine masculine and feminine energies back from their, well, unhealed, imbalanced state to their awakened state, and back into unity. But there was a lot of always multi-layered dimensions to the work. Um, it didn't end there. It has continued. And this year I went on one of the biggest trips that I've been guided on to date. And I didn't really know what to expect because I didn't have the structure or the system of the chakras to glean a lot of information from. This is now much bigger. And what I was guided to do was to travel up through Spain and France and also visit one of the Canary Islands. And one of the major themes of this trip was the number 8. And that's because it was associated with the eighth dimension. Working off a 9-dimension model in this instance, not that that's everything, but in this instance, that's how I was perceiving it. And perceiving the eighth dimension as, that field of unformed, infinite potential and timelessness just beyond, source, the Big Bang, whatever. Like a Taurus, like a womb space associated with the divine feminine of creation, the Akashic records, infinity, all of those things. And so 8 again was thematically threaded throughout this whole work, and the eighth dimension. And so it was guided by the Divine Mother. Um, I work with the divine feminine, divine mother in multiple iterations from different wisdom traditions and philosophies. Predominantly, though, I would say that my closest association is with Mother Mary of, well, the Christian tradition, but I don't subscribe to the dogma and doctrine of conventional or traditional Christianity. And so Mary Magdalene, and Yeshua would be 3 of my primary guides on this work. Also, Pleiadians and other beings of light. And the Divine Mother was very much guiding this particular trip. And what she guided me to do was to visit 8 churches and cathedrals dedicated to her, um, Mary in this instance. One of them wasn't. One of them was dedicated to Mary Magdalene. Um, its position was very relevant in the work I was doing on the grid. And in going to these 8 cathedrals, it was bringing me from, I began in Gibraltar, I dipped into Morocco, I went up through Spain, through France as far as Notre Dame, and then I went down to the most western Canary Island, El Hierro. And there were many reasons for this. And it was all centered around aligning us to our infinite selves, our infinite consciousness, our infinite potential. Um, so that when we do that, when we go back to the 0 point, and the 0 point was hugely thematic throughout this whole work, going back to the 0 point, that it is from there that we can move forward in a new pattern. That the trajectory that we currently find ourselves on, we can't course correct. It's too misaligned. So returning to that 0 point is essential. And this is something that we all know in spiritual practice. Um, and so that was one of the aims of this. And going through cathedrals, of course, are not only dedicated to the Divine Mother, but they're temples of vibration and frequency. And a lot of places I was guided to do the work when there were masses being held at the time, and not again because of the dogma or doctrine of organized or institutionalized religion, but just be simply because of the collective field, and using that to amplify the work. And also that the cathedrals, because of that frequency and vibration, were like notes. And again, 8 as in an octave. And so we were really like playing chords across time and space. And also because there seemed to be a transposition of the grid from one octave to another. Not only in frequency, but in location. So I have a theory. I don't have the full picture of what's going on here. I have a lot of dots that I can connect, and I might return later to how I think that places in the system, Earth's Kundalini system at least, like the third eye and the heart, I believe on this solstice and March's equinox, that they were transposed in their positioning on the grid. Also because of the octahedron, and the octahedron, the points of which aligning to the north and south poles magnetically of the Earth, and it being part of the grid system. So multiple ways. But one of the other things that I was doing was I was working up through the land masses in longitude. So I was working from south to north. And as I was moving, I was hitting on 3 of the 0 point prime meridians on the planet that we associate with time and space, effectively. And so currently the prime meridian on the planet is Greenwich. And we navigate an awful lot through time and space to that 0 point, that prime meridian. Obviously, it's not the only one. And at least in this work that I was doing in Europe, there were 3 lines, lines of longitude that were at some time considered to be the 0 point prime meridian on the planet. And they are Greenwich, as I mentioned, but also Paris and the Pharaoh meridian, which was set by the Greek mathematician and astrologer Ptolemy in 117 AD. And he set it at the most western part of land that they knew to exist at that time, which was the most western part of the Canary Island, El Hierro. And they set that at zero, and then they could work eastwards up to Greece. Um, they didn't have a negative number system, you see, so they couldn't set Greece as zero and then go negatively in numbers down to that. So that was a 0 point. So as I traveled, I was hitting these lines of longitude. And I was also sending energy out through the grid latitudinally. And so I was working um, in axes, um, which of course is extremely symbolic of our experience of space and time, and relates to the symbology of the crucifixion and that axis that of the precession of the equinoxes, etc. And so there was a guidance to connect the grid and connect our collective consciousness to that 0 point. And in doing so, like recalibrating to it, that we would lose or detach from the construct of linear time that we perceive at the level of the human mind or this level of consciousness. And of course, you can see dimensions as simply levels of consciousness. And that, of course, we're looking to evolve and ascend to another level, which is to transform our human experience fully of our reality. So, um, a lot happened in the month-long journey. It was really quite incredible, and it included some really really quite extraordinary events, downloads, etc. And finishing off in the Canary Islands was quite incredible because once every 4 years they fete Our Lady because she's the patroness of the island, and they bring her from that western point in a church, and they descend her um, along the spine of the island to the east for a month, one lunar cycle, and then they bring her back, and they pay gratitude to her for saving them many times from drought, etc. So there was so much in the trip, including the solstice, which is kind of it was in the middle of everything. And I'm going to try to give you again a little bit of context as to how this arose. And when I first had my, I suppose, big spiritual awakening that really initiated me into this work, my guides, one of the first things that they did was lead me to an incredible human called Matthias Stefano, not in person, but to his work that was available online. And I was extremely drawn to it and knew at a soul level that this was just, it landed with me. But it wasn't until some time later that it transpired that I would be doing similar work on the planet. And this was something of an education, at which Matthias is exceptional. And so I went about doing my work for the past kind of 2.5 years on the planet. And all the time, it was a steep learning curve and trying to inform myself, with a lot of Matthias's back catalogue, and also watching what was unfolding for him in the moment. And of course, all this time, he was continuing to do his work on the planet. And I became very aware the more that my work continued that, like, Matthias and I would work at separate sites on solstices, on equinoxes, etc. And even at this year's equinox, I was aware of my position on the planet and a triangulation being formed between where I was, where Matthias was in Yucatan in Mexico, and the Great Pyramid. And again, that's part of the grid work that is beginning to unfold, that I'm beginning to piece together quite a lot of the jigsaw. Um, And this time around, for this trip, it was guided that I would actually be in the same place as Matthias, and that is Holy Nada Festival, which is his own event, which he runs. And it was a 3 day event. So for 2 days you prepare, and on the third day, I suppose the main event of the work is done through activations or whatever activations and meditations. And so I attended at this stage. I had come up from Gibraltar into Morocco up through Spain, and this was being held in the Basque Country. And as soon as I was in Matthias's energy, my energy definitely became more activated and expanded, and I was aware um, of my energy being my guides were stepping into my energetic field. And that was something that I had been actually training and preparing for 6 months in advance on the guidance of my guides. Um, Not really knowing where we were going with that, other than I was developing that ability to do work. And yeah, I felt that was very pronounced. And the following day, we had three separate sessions with Matthias in preparation. Um, each one more profound and beautiful than the last, and really, really opening our systems. And I had a couple of experiences during that, which uh, again were just very, very pronounced in connecting to Yeshua. And one of them was Matthias instructed the crowd, the attendees, to, without thought, but on the basis of intuition, just to take a path, just to walk and take a path. And when I did, I felt then that Yeshua was actually, I was encapsulated in him. He had stepped into my auric field, um, and I could feel his thoughts, his energy, his like physical self. And so I was inside, almost witnessing this along for the ride. And I walked to an elevated site of the part of the site at a tree, not far away from the stages, which were four risers in the shape actually of a cross, where Matthias and his lovely team of musicians face one another in the shape of a cross. And at the center of the risers was an olive tree, which the energy seemed to be being directed to, because it was at the heart of the work that we were doing. And I was looking down on this with all of the attendees at that stage. I was getting the word revelers, that they were dancing and chanting. And um, I looked on, and there was a deep sadness, a very deep sadness overcame me. I didn't weep, but I felt I could have, and there was inevitability about it. And I had kind of the thought that they have no idea what's about to come. And I also heard Mount of Olives when I had arrived at the tree. And I feel that that was an amalgamation of two events that are actually described in the canonical Gospels. Um, Jesus, when he weeps, he wept on the Mount of Olives before he went into Jerusalem before the crucifixion. And when he did go into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, that he was heralded by the revelers in attendance. And it felt like an amalgamation of those two things. That night and the last session of that day with Matthias, um, he sang this frequency and transmission that was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever heard or experienced. Um, and it just transported me to, I don't know where. I wasn't getting any form of vision or anything, but just feeling. And I felt again that my experience was that of Yeshua's. It felt both ancient and timeless. And it did feel that there was a lot of grief and sadness again associated with the energy and tapping into um, possibly multiple lifetimes. And I was getting a great sense of Yeshua as a child, um, and getting a great sense of how sacred he he is and was, but not in a way that put him above anyone else. It was a sense of we are all this sacred, and it was a very pronounced and beautiful experience. That, again, and it was a remembrance. It seemed like a remembrance of an entire soul path through many lifetimes, and this is where I'm just going to add in an aspect of the grid work that I mentioned earlier regarding transposition. And before Matthias went into this session, he mentioned Iran as being considered the heart of Earth's Kundalini system, like the actual snake, you've got the head of the snake as the third eye in Turkey, which is relevant to this work, and the heart in Iran, and had even invited an Iranian singer. And when we came out of that really, really beautiful and profound session, I felt guided to go onto my phone, onto social media, which felt awful to me to do that in the moment, but I did regardless. And I knew I was getting the nudge. And the first thing I saw that there had been an earthquake in Iran while we were in that session. And not only that, but it came 8 days after I had been in Hercules Cave in Morocco and sent energy from that latitude across. And my guide said to me at the time, like, notice where the latitude is on the globe, on the grid where you're sending energy to. And I knew that it was Iran. And that exact latitude that I was at in Morocco, sending it over there, is where the earthquake hit 8 days later. And during that session with Matthias on the eve of the solstice. Um, and I don't think any of those things are coincidental. So that was Earth certainly reacting and energy moving in the system. And again, about the transposition is that I believe that a further, could have been a further 8 days later, I'm not sure, but that the heart of the system migrated from Iran up to the center of France is one of the interpretations that I have of the work that happened. It may not be the case when I sit down and kind of, I've maps upon maps of grid work to do, but it's what I was feeling at the time. The following day was the solstice. And I suppose there was a lot of activities during the morning and during the day, before we got to Matthias taking to the stage and completing with the final activation. And when we got to that point, it began to rain heavily enough that the organizers dispersed the attendees and were to recall them when we were going to reconvene to do the work. And I found myself gathering my belongings from in front of the stage and just walking, taking a path of direction without thinking about it, funnily enough, as it happens, and ending up underneath the exact same tree that I had been the day before. And being at that very point allowed me a direct line of sight down to the olive tree again. And Matthias, as it happens, was already in trance and already sitting at the base of the tree doing the work. And because of his position at the base of the tree with the risers surrounded and so many people dispersed, not many people were aware that he was actually there. And my guides told me, this is it, you're up, it's time to work. And I didn't feel confident enough to go down and actually join Matthias at the tree. So I sat into meditation where I was, and felt that we were definitely, I was definitely connecting to his field and connecting to his work. And Yeshua then stepped into my auric field again, and in a very pronounced and profound way began to, it was as though I was or not that I, but that the crucifixion was being experienced through me. Um, and I wasn't feeling any form of physical pain. And again, I wasn't seeing any like visions or who was there or detail. It was a feeling. It was the emotional feeling of the event, and the energetic release of that from my system, not my system, but the system. Um, and just before I go on, like Matthias had prefaced this work by explaining that, explained a huge amount of things very well, but one of them, that the olive tree was going to be the work, how, what was, I suppose we were directing this work to, and that its symbology centered around, the olives for peace, but also the oil that would anoint and consecrate, which has huge affinity with Christ consciousness. Also that chrism oil, though, a part of the amrita or nectar that flows down your throat when you have a full kundalini awakening. And of course that happens when there's that union of polarity in the system, where the kundalini can rise. And we were using the tree to unify those two polarities, so it could rise up the tree. And it was the tree of life, and so there was all sorts of this symbology. And he did um reference our ascension to Christ consciousness, or like our evolution to that state of being, which um, you could call a Kundalini awakening also. Um, so my body began to actually move in waves. I would almost reach a crescendo where my back would arc, and I would be reaching like a zenith of, whether that was a wave of pain. Um, and when I did, there would be a few times there was a synchronistic bolt of lightning and peal of thunder, which in itself is the unification of polarity or the balance of charge. So of course, massively symbolic and hugely dramatic. Um, in fact, my guide said to me, just to add another thing in, they said to me a few days later about it, how the lightning strikes happen in the ionosphere, and that those ions are like atoms or molecules that, they kind of hold a charge, or they're either positive or negative in charge. And again, that separation where, the positive and negative get to that zenith of being so far separated, and the universe always seeking to reach and achieve equilibrium, that there's then this discharge that brings things back to balance or neutrality. And they just said of the word union to break it up into union. And they're like, it's like union yourself in releasing yourself from that separation and coming back into union, which I thought was quite clever. Um, and that's in one way how you could perceive what was happening. So my body was physically um, taken over. I was expressing, my back was arching. I was kind of letting out these. I was struggling to breathe. I was gasping for breath. And when the height of this release would happen, my body would then collapse into the release, and I would be gasping for breath and then sobbing at the same time. Sorry. Um, and the release and the sobbing was definitely had a sense of why have you forsaken me, and it was a very human experience of sorry, feeling tortured and abandoned. And it was very deep and it was very real and it was very sad. And I just suppose I could put loads of words on the very human and visceral sadness of being in that position. And a crowd at this stage had begun to form around Matthias. So I no longer had a direct line of sight, and I decided to move down and got very close to the tree so that I could see him. And I was only a few feet away. And then I had this very big release where something came up from the depths of me. It wasn't me. Um, and rose up through my body, and my whole body tensed up, and I let out this silent scream to the heavens. Um, and then afterwards, there was like this bolt of light came down through me and down into the earth. So again, there was that polarity um of both things happening, the release and then the influx. And I know that some people believe that Yeshua didn't die on the cross, and I don't know either way, and I'm very open to either way. It's not something that I've received a personal download about from Yeshua. I don't know. And, there are times when I've been traveling in India, he's brought me to places in India. I've been to Egypt, I've been to Glastonbury. I've felt like I've walked in his footsteps. And again, I don't necessarily hold an opinion either way, um, definitively as to what may have happened in that instance. So I don't know if that was meant to be his final breath or not. I don't know. Um, but I do know that in the canonical gospels, because I looked it up afterwards, that it does actually, I think it's in Matthew's, say something like he breathed his last breath. And I don't know, but it was certainly felt like it was the crescendo of a process for sure. Um, all throughout this time this is happening, my heart was beating very, very fast. Um, and that was kind of it, really. Um, my roommate on the event, who I was definitely meant to meet, we hugged afterwards, and I just collapsed into sobbing because of just the extent of what had just occurred. Matthias moved to a different area of the site, to a stone circle, and we followed, and there were further activations and downloads. Um, but I think that was, at least for me, um, that was what I was there to do. I was there to assist in the releasing of the trauma of the crucifixion. And okay, so here's how I'm interpreting that. Before I go on, there have been multiple different downloads that I've received after this, um, of all this, quite a lot of different nuance to do with, you know, what that means. And I'm sure that that's only the tip of the iceberg. Um, but I effectively think that our karmic cycles are being released from collective consciousness. Because unless that happens, then we can't evolve. So if we keep repeating the same patterns that are based in the human egoic mind, and effectively just to call it separation consciousness, then you can't evolve. So we have to transcend that level of consciousness, separation consciousness, and come back to unity. We know that that's what we're doing. Um, and on the eve of arriving in Amalur to this event, I had a karmic pattern in my life very suddenly resolve after a very long period of time of me being in, um, I felt contracted with this person. We had work to do in this lifetime, and it took years for it to process out. And it was very deep, and it itself was very visceral. And we all have a cross to bear, and we all have an initiation through a crucifixion. And we can either continue to repeat that pattern of the human suffering, victimhood, separation from love through our egoic construct, which we've inherited and evolved from animals, and that kind of primal um, instinct to survive, and believing and perceiving that we are in lack of something that we need to survive, that it's in limited supply in the external world, and that we have to compete in order to get it. That sort of primal mentality, and that lack then having us attached to specific external outcomes in order to fulfill that lack, and controlling and manipulating our world, motivated by fear, in order to fulfill or get those outcomes to manifest or materialize to fulfill the lack. And so this constant pattern of karmic cycle that we are somewhat stuck in, and unless we come back into coherence between the two hemispheres of the mind, and then coherence between the mind and the heart, then we can't overcome that. And I think that's probably one of the things that was achieved by Yeshua through the initiation process of the crucifixion, in that certainly in the canonical texts, he was, he is claimed to have been in the Garden of Gethsemane, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, on the eve of the crucifixion, praying three times to the Father, which is paternal pattern, um, for the cup to pass from him. And of course, though, he was um, saying that whatever the Father's will was, that he would do. And then on the cross, of course, it's our small will, it's our egoic will that is activated and triggered by those primal instincts to survive. And so we believe that we're in lacking something. We attach to a specific outcome, and we try to control and manipulate our world out of fear to try to fix what we believe is lacking. And he made the switch from that victimhood into mastery, from separation into unity, from fear into love, by allowing himself to surrender to that process, knowing that there is no death, and knowing that there is only love. Um, and by making that leap and surrendering into it, then of course we know that he forgave, or asked, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." Um, and then by switching and mastering, by switching to love, then of course that changes the whole pattern, and that's what allows us to evolve and to ascend. Um, and I think it's interesting that, of course, when that happened 2,000 years ago, that didn't initiate a collective or mass awakening of consciousness where we were able to transcend that pattern. That's not what happened. And I think deliberately, so that we were shown the lesson, And then we had to learn it for ourselves the hard way. And in doing that, in having the benefit of that extent of pattern in order to reflect upon, then we can extract the wisdom of that and see how choosing fear or separation is the root cause of the suffering, um, and that it replicates that pattern. And so taking that wisdom informs our will, and not the will of the small self from that pattern, but of higher will to choose what is higher, which is love. And then, of course, we can certainly create a different pattern. And so the passage of time, I suppose, informs that. But then there's there's an extricating ourselves from time itself, because the ego is always projecting into the past and the future and not in the present moment. But I'm going to share with you something else about the present moment that Yeshua shared with me when I got back from the trip, and I was asking him about time, and he said, "Okay, well, let's go for a walk. Let's go." So we went out into a beautiful like meadow in his, what I'll just call his homeland, um, at dusk, and everything was so still. And he just asked that we just stand there and come into stillness and present with that moment. And he said, just notice the soil and the earth beneath your feet, and just sense the temperature, the moisture, how you could feel how shaded it had been throughout the scorching day. And now, how much sunlight was left in the day according to its even cooling temperature. And to just feel the amount of heat left in the sun as it falls on your face. Feeling the strength leave, and how everything was beginning to mute and fade. And the colours, the pinks and the blues, becoming hazy and soft. And on your back, in the shadow, how it's really beginning to cool. And around the linen on your skin enters a soft, very soft breeze. Again, dropping in temperature, becoming cool. You may get a shiver down your spine or feel goosebumps. And he asked then to notice how in this moment, on some level, your mind might begin to think of how far away from home you are, how the day is beginning to close out, how your circadian rhythm on your third eye might be activating now, how you might be aware of how long it is until it's time to sleep. That just gave me shivers. How you might become aware of how much food you've had to eat, and if you'd like to have an evening meal. And he was talking about all of these ways how being fully present in the present moment was inextricably linked to how bound we are to time, how bound we are to this physical earth and its revolution around the sun. And how, until such time as our psyche, our survival mechanisms, and our linear perceptions are unbound by that construct, can we really know what it is to be an eternal being? And how beyond that construct in this dimension, there really is infinite potential as we tap into and become our infinite selves. And I think that's part of the whole crucifixion initiation also. That surrender to something beyond what we have perceived and known. That through a mechanism in our brain and our consciousness, which has formed over millions of years of evolution, that there really isn't any death, that we can't die, that there is no lack, that we can't possibly be in control with our small will. But I think for Yeshua, one of the differences was that he knew absolutely that all that was happening in that process was that he was dissolving back into oneness with love. And I think one of the things for us in making that leap is that we unfortunately came into this world, and through those survival mechanisms and relying on the external world, made a switch in our psyche from our infinite and unconditional consciousness to the finite and conditional mind. And how we learned very quickly that love was conditional. And so we learned that it wasn't safe and that we couldn't trust it. And where that it caused separation is the very place that needs the most love. And it can be difficult to break that pattern and cycle when the very parts of you that are in most need of that love are the ones that don't trust it and resist it. Um, it's the case that love is both home and the path home. And that breaking that pattern is very much that leap of surrender into it. And, that's part of why in this process, releasing the karma of the crucifixion from collective consciousness allows us to break that pattern. And that those of us who are maybe more ahead on this evolutionary process, as Yeshua did for 2,000 years with other ascended masters, we then, by surrendering into love and breaking the karmic pattern of separation consciousness, we become the space holders for others. We become the points in the grid that hold that level of consciousness. So a rising tide lifts all boats, so that we reach that tipping point where the rest can follow. But I also think that it might suggest what I have seen a lot of other spiritual commentators and channelers allude to in there being a split or a separation, that some souls who are incarnated currently might take further lifetimes to go through that karmic pattern to learn the wisdom before they feel they can make the leap back to unity. And I think that this is a very, very pivotal point that has happened, in that it's always there, if you will, in terms of Yeshua. Like the kingdom is already here, and it's always a matter of simply us aligning to us, because it is what we are. Um, but that others might continue to choose to evolve before um they come back into unity. And so, yeah, it might speak to a very pivotal divide in the free will choice that is still present. I also think that, you know, whereas you might find in your own life over the past month that things may have happened in relationships very instantly, where the energy shifted and the dynamic changed and the pattern changed. I know I've found that. I know my clients have found that. I've heard a lot of people say it to me. And where was I going with that? Yes, that it can happen. It can happen very, what may have taken 2,000 years, or may have taken like a quarter of a lifetime, or like that suddenly things happen in the moment that they only can, which is the moment of now. They happen in an instant where things shift. And you may have noticed that. But also, it's the case, I think, that this is now going to integrate over an extended period of time, um, which could be 7 to 8 years. And again, that would tie in with a lot of and I'm not a prophet, but a lot of commentators who have always defined 2025 to 2032 as one of our greatest leaps towards a more evolved level of consciousness, and so dimension of reality that we live in. Um, and it's a possible, of course, astrologically, that's going to align with a lot of different alignments. And I'm not an astrologer, but I do think that, like, Uranus coming into Gemini there, shortly after the solstice, and that particular 8 year cycle, with many other things, of course, it's only, there's a lot going on there, but there's a time frame that is interesting for all of these cycles to play out, which seem to align with this potential cycle of releasing ourselves from karmic pattern. Um, I think that's probably enough for this video. There is so much more that I just don't know that I'd be here for another hour or two if I were to go into all of the aspects, all of the dimensions that were shown to me, and all of the wonderful happenings that happened on the road. Really quite incredible. I now have work to do on the grid itself, because there's one way of looking at this where, if you're familiar with cymatics, which is the study of how frequency informs how matter forms. So effectively, everything materializes in geometric structure according to what frequency it vibrates at, and that's studied through cymatics. And so effectively, you can see things like they put sand or water on a plate, and then they set it to a particular frequency, and you can see the sand or the atoms construct into a particular geometric pattern in correlation to the frequency that they're vibrating at. And I think that, the grid has reached a particular level, that of a level of frequency and vibration, that it'll change its structure. And of course, that structure is what we will then, in coherence, manifest in coherence to or with, if that makes sense. I hope I'm making sense. I can see it in my head. And that could be an element of the transposition of the grid. Another element of the transposition of the grid, of course, is that from one of the last times that Earth would have lived in unity consciousness, and okay, let's just say Atlantis, where was I going with that? That things like the anchor points of the grid itself, like magnetic or geomagnetic north, the poles of the planet have migrated and shifted. And so if they migrate and shift, you could imagine that the whole grid system does as well. Um, so yeah, again, there's work to do there, but I do think that there was something of a transposition, possibly because of the migration of north, migrated other points with it, and there was a recalibration in the system was happening. Or again, like that the structure itself is just reforming into a different geometrical pattern in coherence with a higher frequency or vibration. And I think, again, a lot of commentators have been mentioning recently, the phrase tipping point, which I was receiving a lot myself before I went on this. And I think it's the case that um, we have become more heart activated and heart led and in coherence between our head and our heart. That tipping point is a feedback loop between ourselves and the grid, and that that's gotten to a point where it has become self-perpetuating almost, because we've reached that good critical mass to tip it over that edge, that's the case, because I think the structure had collapsed in places, and because we had overlaid a different grid system, like the one that you see literally on the globe, of the longitude and latitude, and our perception of moving through space and time. But it was all a very linear construct of the mind, and because we had adopted that, and again, I'm using a phrase of another commentator, the false matrix, moving from that false matrix as it deconstructs to the organic matrix, and that's just a different, it's a different geometry and level of consciousness, of course. Um, there is a lot more. I'm gonna leave it there, folks, because I'll continue to expand on all of this, because these are all fundamental elements of our experience, as we progress through the ascension and evolution of consciousness, vibration, and dimension. And I'd like to thank you for coming along on that sharing with me, and know that my guides, Mary and Yeshua, work extremely closely with me, and have guided me to work on people's individual systems in the same way. So all the same principles apply in terms of how we experience separation consciousness and how we return to unity. And so I do that on an individual level, both in person and on Zoom. So somewhere, wherever you're watching this video, you can find a link, and you can always find me on www.lightworks.ie, and I am at Lightworks Dublin on both Instagram and Facebook, should you wish to find me. I'm open for bookings and delighted to be walking this path with you. And again, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.